Having arrived at March, the leaves of the northern hemisphere put forth as nature's first green as gold, while the thoughts of the south are autumnal. And we are happy to welcome you to March 2022's Urbit Developer Call. We're immensely pleased to host long-term contributor and member of the community, rabsef-bicrym, to today's call. Hello, Eric.
Hey, how you doing?
Pretty good. rabsef has operated a number of Urbit communities over the years and through various eras, including buffoonery, Hooniverse, and Hollow Mars theory. And he works today with Quartus as a full-time Hoon developer. He serves as the voice of Hoon for those of you who learned from the older Hooniversity videos, and he's kind of been a man about town for the many things that Urbit has been over the past few years. So we're happy to have you today, Eric.
Well, I'm really pleased to be here, and dilettante of all things Urbit, I think, is a good descriptor of me. So thank you for that introduction.
So tell us a little bit about your path-dependent arrival at the present state of affairs. How did you get involved with Urbit and etc.?
So I think one of the things that I wanted to do in the talk that I sort of planned out for us today is describe that path. So I'm glad that you bring us there early. I think you'll see this over the course of sort of the 3 points that I've laid out, but effectively, I've always had an interest in computing as a serviceable augmentation to life and computing as sort of something that I can compose and take with me places. And so I've always had this interest in computing, but I didn't achieve a computing interest as my primary mode of work when I went through college. And I went through college to get a degree in philosophy, ended up going to law school and got a JD. During the law school process, I kind of realized that the law was very much not like a computer. It was not, outside of maybe bankruptcy, it was not logical and ordinated and serviceable in the same way that I thought it was going to be as a linguistic pursuit. And so I was looking for a job towards the end of law school, found something where I could work in computer science or technology, I should say more adroitly, in law firms. And so I was helping them implement technology against their work and decrease the amount of time that they were spending doing menial tasks. We implemented AI contract review and all sorts of stuff like that. But it still wasn't scratching the itch. Eventually, I got into Urbit. I think this was around 2019, and maybe mid to late. In fact, I looked up when my planet was first booted, but I don't have that note in front of me any longer. But it was mid 2019-ish, and started sort of poking around. Tried to do Hoon School under Rapfire Diglet, and needed a lot of help to get through that process. But that triggered in me something that I think was really critical to my development path. And that was, Neal, I'll get off subject for just a second here. I used to be very overweight. And there was a point in my life where I was over 300 pounds. And at a certain point, I kind of realized, hey, if these other people can do being healthy and, can do having reasonable bodies, then I should be able to do that too. And that stimulus of like, I'm just as good as these other people, or even if I'm not as good as them, I can try as hard as I need to get to their level. It pushed me to find a path towards a more healthy lifestyle. And similarly, coming into Hoon School and realizing I couldn't grasp the idea of the subject at first, right? Like these things were outside of my limits and other people were just succeeding with them. And I thought, these people may be marginally smarter than me, but they're not going to try harder than me. And so I started working and spending lots of hours trying to understand these simple things in Hoon. And eventually it just started to become ingrained, just like any form of practice. The more you do it, the more you have access to it. And I started being able to produce programs, and I started wanting to do that as a lifestyle, as an occupation. And eventually, through many experimentations and attempts to find a career in that path across across the limited surface area of those people who are employing to do Hoon at this time, right? I found a path with Dalten Collective, the organization that I had also joined in late 2019, Dalten Collective being a group of people who are interested in fellowship, sustainability, and sovereignty, we are attempting as a group to find ways that we can sort of employ ourselves and find our own way to facilitate our fellowship together in a sustainable way through sovereign enterprise. And Quartus is a development of that Dalten activity more generally. It's a way that we can move into that space of finding and producing value in our community so that we can continue our other operations. Okay. I hope that gives a little bit of a narrative there.
Yes. So stepping back a little bit in time, then you had previously been working with IT and essentially process and task automation. So what was different about Urbit when you encountered it from what you had been working with in the prior world?
Yeah, I think the biggest differentiator I can draw immediately from that line of occupation is the interconnectedness of data. So one of the biggest problems that we often had at the law firm is we would have a lot of data in our document management system, in case tracking systems, in software applications that we were using to review documents, etc. And stitching those things together into a cohesive narrative was pulling teeth and hurting cats at the same time, right? Like it was just an awful pursuit. Also, with limited development, you can imagine that maybe law firms don't draw the best development talent that's out there. Those people probably want to work at purely software companies. It's not to say that we had bad talent. It's just that we're not getting the new all-stars in terms of our technology people. So we had limited resources and also we just weren't employing that many of them. We had limited resources to work with and limited ability to stitch those data together. Urbit, in stark contrast, has this amazing ability to, first of all, make sure that your data is available to you as you would like to use it. But secondly, to handle a lot of that interconnectedness for you through the veins that are available. So Gall makes intercommunication of agents relatively, exceedingly easy compared to the original form of interconnectedness we have, where we have to design these API tools to communicate between applications. So that would be the biggest contrast I experience. But there are also a lot of other value adds too.
Do you think that was conditioned by your background in law and legal philosophy? Like you were trained towards certain modes of thought. Do you think that impacted the way that what you wanted to see in a computing system?
Yeah, and maybe not even yes, I think that philosophy more primitively, and then the law as I imagined it, perhaps not as it is practiced, led me to an appreciation of the soundness of Urbit. So I really enjoyed in philosophy the study of epistemology and how we know things. And I have some designs that we might talk about a little later for how epistemology might be augmented by Urbit. But I think in a nutshell, we can say I have a penchant for structured and organized data. All of my notes always come out of me as ordinated lists. Like that's just the way that I think. And Urbit sort of acts like that. It mirrors my way of thinking about the world in having very rigorously structured data that's available where you put it, that's sort of subordinate to other data. These modes of structuring thought, I think, do mirror my own. Yeah, that's actually a really interesting point.
Eric, are you trapped in a feedback loop?
No, can you hear me?
No, I'm talking about your mental processes being reinforced by the way that Urbit works and vice versa.
That's right. No, yes, it's definitely confirmation bias at minimum. But I think it's right though. Like this may draw us into one of the first points of my talk, but some of my early thoughts about how computing should work is that it should be a structural layer for me to offboard some of my thoughts onto, not a pervasive screen through which I experience the world, right? So it is subordinate to my desires. It is a extension of my memory capacity rather than a new form of input to me. I didn't need any more input. I had experience, lends itself to enough input that I can be sated for a lifetime. So what I needed was something to help me organize that information and turn it into meaningful content. I'll give 2 examples of that too.
Should I jump over to your slides?
Yeah, sure. Let's do that. So one of the big influences for me in terms of computing was the personal data assistant. So I was born in 85. I think the Casio Boss, which was one of the first widely available, travelable digital Rolodexes, came out in 84. So these have been omnipresent throughout my entire life. And when I was a kid, I really wanted one. I would nag my mom to buy me these businessmen organizers, and would get them sometimes and not know what to do with them, right? I was like, okay, cool. Now I can put my address in, and that's the only address I know. So, so I'm not sure what I'm doing with this, but it functioned as that offboarding of thought, that offboarding of memory for me, right? It allowed me to put information into the system that I didn't have to track anymore, which allowed me to have the social interactions that I wanted without the expense of having to remember people's names. In fact, I remember there was a children's model that came out later, a Casio digital organizer, and it had the ability to do, what's his name? Fuzzy Willy, the thing where you can draw with the little iron shavings on a picture of a person's face. So it had that, so you could do the contact, and then you could also kind of design a face and help you remember the person by their face. Now, I don't have face blindness. I did know somebody in college who did, and she could never remember who I was. Maybe that was just an excuse. I'm not sure. But I do think it's very helpful to have that kind of offboarding of simple memory tasks to a computer. And to get back to where I started here, the 2 examples of kind of what I'm talking about, I think are depicted well in 2 literary figures, Goethe and Lovecraft. So Goethe had this character of I think he called it the curator, like an archetypal character of a curator or a collector. And it's this person who wants to bring all of the information that they can close to them and keep tokens, mementos of that around them, so that they have this feeling of, well, we all know completionists, right? We see the Funko Pop collections on Twitter every day, but this is more about mental completionism and having the ability to parse all of the brilliant ideas that have come about through the course of human history and sort of keep them in a collection and keep them organized and available and accessible to the collector. And
kind of a Francis Bacon notion of science as a culmination of collecting facts and viewpoints and then systematizing them.
Right. And unfortunately, I'm a Kuhnian, but I still think that it's a worthy pursuit, right? I don't think that we're actually doing a cumulative activity there, but or at least I'm not convinced that we're doing a cumulative activity, but I do think that it is an important mode of operation. Anyway, and Lovecraft did the same thing. He was very much of the opinion that he was on the earth to collect facts. In fact, oftentimes he would say, the only thing that prevents me from suicide is the fact that I can't think of a clean way of doing it. And also there's so many other things that I could read, right? This was his sort of raison d'etre as he was writing these works that he thought were unsuccessful and were never accepted into weird tales and so on. But yeah, so the PDA as an influence to me was this this tool that I could carry around with me wherever I went, that would have access to those data points that were important to me, and that would allow me to, like I say, continue my social interactions unabridged by a technical divide, but augmented and perhaps supported by them. And we do at Quartus a lot of work to try and make products that mirror that design for us. So Urbit for me, as I say, is this sort of organizational layer where I can keep my data, but it is something I can carry around in my pocket with me, right? I have the Escape app on my phone, and I can use it wherever I am. I can get to my applications and pull up my data there. But I'm not often, or at least not as much as I was in the late 80s and early 90s, in front of people face to face, where I'm having the social communication and IR sending them my digital information through my Casio boss or whatever, right? Instead, there is still a lot of social interaction online. And so, and Urbit facilitates that as well. So we have groups and we have resources inside of those groups where we can have socialization. A lot of the work that we've done at Quartus to date has been influenced by the desire to integrate the data storage aspects of Urbit, the ability to draw information from throughout your server, and the social modality of communication, the sort of inbuilt way that we socialize on Urbit. So this is like mirroring that. I have my PDA in my pocket. I know it could take care of the data for me if I need it to, or issue some command or do something simple like that. I can still have the social interaction, and this is a non-obtrusive entry point for my technological assistance. Interestingly, I just found out about a new group on Urbit that I think is taking this really seriously. The group is called Homunculus. Let me see if I can get their Pat P. I don't know if I have it in front of me, but they're thinking about this in the same sort of, I think, in the same way. I haven't actually talked with that group yet, but they're thinking about how can Urbit be this non-invasive personal assistant that provides you with experiences that otherwise you wouldn't have, but still avoids the tribulations of centralized data aggregation services that invariably need to turn you into a commodity, and so perhaps abuse some of those informations that they gather about you.
So I think that addresses to a small extent my next question for you, which is what makes Urbit different from, I mean, I don't know if you've tried Roam, Obsidian, Notion. There have been a lot of platforms over the years that people have come with to organize information, mind mapping, these sorts of things. What about Urbit makes it feel different to you?
Well, there's a lot of interesting points there. I have tried Roam and Notion. I haven't tried Obsidian. I'll have to take a look at that. But
it's a freeware, or it's an open source Roam.
Okay,
quite similar.
Okay, nice. Because I actually pay for Roam now, shamefully. We'll have to take a look at that. But yeah, I guess the primary differentiator for me there is the layer of, like, there's an impermeable membrane, or at least a semi-permeable membrane around applications like Roam and Notion and Obsidian that isn't as difficult to surmount as it might be on Urbit for that same type of information gathering and storage. So you can imagine, like in Notion, you can kind of embed any data type, right? So you can bring the information in, but you're still having to complete that manual activity, and you're still doing that between different modalities, right? Like you're on your web browser and finding a link and then plopping it in there and so on. Those ways of operating definitely work and are good, and I do take notes in Roam, but Urbit's interconnectedness between the applications, the need to design APIs to get applications to intercommunicate being abstracted away by Gall, I think is probably the biggest separator between Roam and Notion and where we might go. Also, to the extent that Roam, I don't know if Notion, but I think it is, like, centralized on their server. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Yeah, like obviously that creates a problem for me too, just as a theoretical concept. Like I don't think Roam's going to read my notes and try and kick me off for having, I don't know what I was going to say, a number of execrable things, but I don't think I'll do that instead. But you could imagine I might have terrible things in my notes, and one might kick me off for that. I don't think that's going to happen with Rome, but I don't like the idea of that being a possibility. And integrating all of my data into one platform and being able to roll my own in that way, I think is a viable concept.
Do you feel like there are different qualitative categories of kinds of knowledge that you would want to put on Urbit versus elsewhere? Or do you think that everything ultimately should live within Urbit?
I think that let me answer sort of the opposite question. I think that there are types of information that would be most conducive. Rather, I think that Urbit would be most conducive to a particular type of information that I think is going really poorly in the current context. And that is effectively, and now we'll see again a turn towards reiteration of my prior penchants, but poor argumentation, right? Like, as a person who studied philosophy and epistemology, who did well in formal logic classes, who went through law school just fine, graduating cum laude and stuff, I get how you're supposed to argue. And I think people do it really poorly. And what I'd like to see is a mode of, there's this website, and I can't ever remember the name of it, but Sarp and Laplux, I think, introduced it to me originally. But it's effectively a website where you can debate assertions. And so you put up an assertion, and people can write plus or minus like co-assertions around that, right? And then those themselves can have plus or minus co-assertions around that. And so you can kind of see, as this branching sort of web structure, the weight of opinion on one side or another of nuanced sub-issues surrounding a larger topic. So, you might think of intervention in the Ukraine, right? And maybe it says we should intervene in the Ukraine, and then the subtopic would be intervention in the Ukraine could mean sending weapons, or it could mean sending people, and sending people would have these, right? And so you can sort of branch out this idea and start unpacking it slowly and deliberately, and with a modicum of rigor. And that's not facilitated by our current discussion modalities. That website notwithstanding, arguments on Twitter are restricted to whatever it is, 244 characters, whatever it is, 288 characters. And even in threads, people aren't reading the entire context of the discussion being made. And as we used to call it in early rhetoric classes, like, it's two ships passing in the night, right? People are talking past each other, or talking towards their point rather than confrontatively and with rigor. What I'd really love to see on Urbit, and I actually have a slide about this, let's pop over there. What I'd really love to see on Urbit is the ability to provide better dialogue systems for those people, reduce the amount of negative gainsaying that seems to happen most of the time, and turn towards more positive or constructive forms of communication that involve rigorously documenting from base level facts, as much as base level facts can be said to exist, base level facts up to narrative suppositions about the world. And we can unpack that a little bit, but yeah, that specifically, I guess, for lack of a better word, political argumentation I would like to see happen on Urbit, and I would like to see it be made rigorous and composable and what's the opposite of composable? Decomposable? The ability to deconstruct the argument and look at its individual.
Modular, perhaps?
Yes, there we go. So we have the, not to continue on here, but we have these ideas about the roles that might exist in this communication pattern. So you might have a base fact finder or a researcher. This person is promoting simple factoids and providing some substantiation on the network, right? Maybe they're testing whether this algae produces more oxygen than carbon dioxide during its respiration and photosynthetic like periods or whatever, right? Like, I don't know, they're producing minimal factoids. Then you might have like something like a journalist or a collector of these facts, right? Like a gallery organizer of these facts who takes simple facts and weaves them into narratives. At this level, reading the narrative, one should be able to see the subordinate facts that help structure the narrative as provenance-bound links to the prior work of the researcher. So at this point, you're starting to construct this modular system for building truth, where you can also inspect the sources sort of as part of the truth expansion. Then we might have readers who are accessing this information and utilizing it, and perhaps paying to see some of it, or tipping the people who are producing these narratives, or even responding to the narratives maybe and producing their own narratives as a result with counterfacts, and we can see that clash. And then lastly, we might have sponsors, people who are capable of providing incentive to these various rungs of construction of ideas, down from the early fact finders through narrative constructors, through the people who are creating arguments between those things. That's the pattern that I want. I'm not sure as to the viability of it. I'm not sure what the ultimate product would look like, but I do sincerely believe in the importance of having a better syllogism to discuss things in the future, lest we lose the ability entirely.
It's a bit getting into the weeds of the technical discussion, but it's interesting to compare what you were just talking about with the actual structure of Clay as a file system, and the way as a version controlled file system, it does preserve the entire provenance of every fact that is entered into Arvo is an event log, right?
Right.
That's getting more esoteric.
No, it's actually right there. One of the things that we have considered is, and this may be a tiny bit glib, but we've considered knock versioning of facts, right? Like, so one of the things that bothers me the most about science popularizers, Neil deGrasse Tyson will go out there and will say, we now know that the quantum model of the atom is the right model, and that the Bohr model no longer correct, right? The electron cloud model no longer correct. We have to have these probabilistic. Well, the cloud is the probabilistic, but the orbits or whatever that was after the Bohr model, whatever. It bothers me to no end that he describes that as the completion of a process of inquiry towards a proven fact, right? Like, I don't believe that representational truth is accurate, but I do think so. So to combat that, I think one way you might be able to better communicate science in like a Kuhnian model is to distill the paradigm down to a solidified version, so that when the paradigm shifts, you'd be able to better compare that and not have that sense of ameliorative, like Peirceanism. Like that's bad. I think it's really negative for people to think that we're at the end of history and that science is bringing us into, true representation, when we have no way of knowing if that's even close to accurate.
Have you read Paul Feyerabend?
No.
His work?
Should I?
Yes, he'd be fun to get. He's a post-Kuhnian philosopher of science who gets really big into Kuhn's idea about incommensurability of theories. Yeah, and how his basic thesis is what is called epistemological anarchy. That what works. Yeah. It's a very pragmatic approach in the end, but
that was ultimately, not to derail entirely, but when I went through philosophy course of study, we start with the Greeks and we move all the way through. We got to existentialism and I was like, this is neat. We got to the early American pragmatists and I was like, this is the one that makes sense. Like, we got there. The one is, you can't have representational truth. So the best you're going to get at truth is, does this predict an outcome in a way that is of utility to you? And I was like, boom, got it. And then I remember asking my favorite teacher of all time, the woman who taught me everything I know about philosophy, I said, what comes after pragmatism? She was like, well, there's not really anything after pragmatism. Like, it's kind of, you can do deconstructionism and then this kind of nonsense. And I was like, no, I'm good. So I found my staying point, and it's Cornel West wearing his giant Super Bowl ring on The American Invasion of Philosophy. If you haven't seen the cover of that book, look it up. It's a great one.
It's interesting to compare this as another aside is I find that the way that things like marks work, where there's sort of this nominal noun that sits in memory, but you always have to access it through an interface, right? Like the mark is always the modality that you're accessing, this sort of this almost unknown thing. You don't necessarily know the internal structure of it at all, but you're always able to access it through an API or a user interface of some kind, or a programmatic interface.
Yeah. So I'm going to stretch that connection a little bit. There was a work that I was really fascinated in when I was in philosophy. It was an argument that happened between Bertrand Russell and William James, if I'm not mistaken. And it was about this guy who called himself Mr. Ballard, or at least they referred to him as Mr. Ballard. And Mr. Ballard's claim was that he was alinguistic, that he had some illness when he was a small child that caused him to be deaf for multiple years, but he regained his hearing, in his teens or something like that. And he claimed that he didn't know how to speak until he was 15 or whatever it was. Now, whether the story's apocryphal or not, it doesn't really matter. The argument that they had was, what language did Mr. Ballard use to communicate with himself before he learned English? And did he communicate with himself? Did he have what could be construed as thoughts during that period of time? And I think my position was always that it doesn't matter if you have words to cut up experience. The brain is a tool designed to cut up experience. And so it's going to do what it's going to do, right? Like, it's going to cut the world up into parts the way it's going to cut the world up into parts. And there are certain bounds on that. You can't think that you can walk through walls, because experience will bite you if you try. But there are, there's some liberalism around that too. You might think of a tree as just the trunk, or the roots and the trunk, or the roots and the trunk and the branches and the leaves, right? You can construct these different dissections of reality. Anyway, the point is, mark files kind of operate like that, right? We have this undifferentiated reality of the tree, right, of the state. And we can point to certain parts of it and go, I want to consider that as this, and use that mark to kind of convert it into the thing that we expect it to be, the parsable entity that we can then use for construction of further thought.
In your notes that you sent me about some of the points you wanted to cover today, you were also talking about Dalten as a vehicle for sense making in the world. So I think this is a reasonable segue into that topic for you.
Yeah, I think I even saw Dashus Navnal in the chat here earlier, but I think he's one of our key sense-making members at Urbit. He is, in fact, the key sense-making member. But our ultimate goal, well, let me reframe that. It's not an ultimate goal. Our ambition towards a process is that we bring as much information about the world as we can from an ideally agnostic, at least pseudo-agnostic to the extent that one can muster it, perspective into our meetings, so that when we talk about the issues that are facing us, we're capable of presenting as much context without prejudgment as to the veracity of the context as possible. And then we attempt, to the best of our ability, to try and find some narrative that makes sense of the factors that we see before us. And also, we try and find where the factors that we see before us might be to some extent misleading. So we've seen a lot of that in the last few weeks as a country and as a world. We've seen a lot of presentation of information that may have been less than accurate to the system on the ground. And our goal at Dalten is to try and kind of wheedle that out, to figure out what's going on there, and try and make sure that we're only paying attention to the parts of information that we can be most satisfied in ourselves for grasping and holding on to. Yeah.
So tell
It's
us a
tough.
little bit. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about what you're building and that comes out of this, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing that Dalten is building is community. And I think that that's one of the most important parts, particularly a community that's capable of having long-form discussions about ideas while attempting to contain any turmoil that those ideas being expressed might create in any one of us. So we try not to be triggered by the information that's being brought in. That's not really something that we're building from a technical perspective, but it is like a social contract that we're building that's also very, very difficult to construct. But I think ultimately the biggest product decision for us towards this end is the knowledge management system that we've been describing and the ways that we're thinking about implementing that. But also, we've thought about things like, actually, this came up in a meeting just yesterday. We built Crow to be Crow is like a chatbot that's also capable of doing slightly more complex tasks for you, but through that primary modality of communication on Urbit. I think I actually even have a slide about this that we can look at. It'll provide you with, like I say, the ability to interact through the chat interface, but then to dredge up other information that you might have on your Urbit and interact with that. We're thinking about doing something really simple like prediction timelines using Crow. So write a little library where someone can in chat say, I believe that X is going to happen within Y time. It's sort of the Scott Alexander model, only without the pretense and the publications on an annual basis, but similar thing, right? So we can start testing our theories against reality. We can see if the predictive force of our ideas is such that they should be adopted, or whether even if attractive as an idea, it doesn't really render predictive force sufficient to take action.
Yeah, I've seen Crow in the wild a fair bit lately.
Yeah, we have it running over at New Hooniverse even. I think that's still running, right? The classroom times? Yeah,
I think
very
so.
Fun. Very fun. I do encourage people to check that one out. We also, this is actually a great point. And I don't think I've covered this here, but I was thinking about talking with the foundation next week. We have kind of a team meeting or something like that coming up. And I was thinking about what are the commitments that Quartus can make for the next quarter in terms of our development. And one of the things, this is on sense making to an extent, but one of the things that I think we're going to really focus on is making sure that we have really extensive documentation of our applications available, and that we make it available through the docs agent. And I can't remember who built docs, but it's a wonderful agent that's available.
Tennis Atlas.
It was tennis? Okay, I thought so, but then I was worried that I was misremembering. But yeah, so we're going to be making sure that our ideas, qua software at least, are tractable on the surface for people who are interested in engaging with them.
Well, one of the fun things is you can have as much interoperability or not as you like between these, right? So Crow's integrated with GraphStore, and it's watching the same sorts of things that everything's going. So you get it for free in Escape and other form factors that are using the same garden desk.
Yeah. This is another interesting point. To the extent that we want to be able to utilize data that's ours, that lives on our Urbit, and to the extent that we can't always necessarily rely on developers to make those points of interest available to us through scribes or pokes or what have you. Generally, they do. I'm not saying this from a critical perspective, but just to the extent that you can't be sure of that, we are also considering ways where we could have low-code or no-code solutions to adding wrapper libraries around agents to better access the state of that agent for us. So just as debug agent makes that available to you in the dojo or in the web debug interface, perhaps we could have something like that that would allow you to more thoroughly inspect the state or interrupt processes that the agent would otherwise expect to complete one way and force them to complete another, or things like that. This is just being able to do more with your data again, being able to do what you want with your data to the extent that you think is appropriate.
So tell us about Orca and Ogre. I haven't seen Ogre yet, so I'm curious about that one especially.
Yeah. Ogre is do I have a slide on Ogre? I don't think. Ogre is actually a really interesting one. Let's start with Orca though. I think that's a good way to go. So one of the promises of Urbit that's been around since I started was that Urbit would allow people to create interest groups and sort of promote them. And to the extent that two people might create a similar interest group, there could be some sort of tangential federation between those two groups, at least where they intersect, at least where there is actually a tangent between them, right? And we built Orca to facilitate that work. So I run a group, as you said earlier, called Buffoonery. It's definitely not the biggest fitness group on Urbit. And as you might be able to tell from my somewhat portly appearance today, I haven't been as good on fitness as I have been in the past for these COVID times. But I still run the group and I really enjoyed working in there. I do know that there are other fitness groups available. I think there's one on Urchan, and I know that there's I think it's Urbit Liftev is the other group that I'm thinking of, I think that's their name. They're a great group, very very populous and have a lot of discussion. Orca allows, but maybe Buffoonery talks about some other things too. We talk about pharmacology, we talk about eating, whatever. We talk about bullshit. I was talking about Eliezer Yudkowsky's underwear for about 30 minutes yesterday. So like maybe some of the topics of discussion in Buffoonery aren't shared with Urbit Liftev, right? Orca allows us to create a channel in each group that we can unify that will allow you to pass likes through Escape back and forth, pass comments back and forth. It will make sure that the ID numbers of chats that come across from the other host are identical, so that if somebody's liking something or if somebody's referencing something, you're only referencing it on your side, and it shares all the reference points. Effectively, it's just a way of duplicating a chat between two groups so that the groups can maintain their differentiated aspects in those other chats that they may have, or those other notebooks or whatever. But to the extent that those groups are tight, share the information where it's relevant. It's been a really fun creation, and I think we have a few of them going in the wild now, so that's a nice one. But Ogre, which we're actually working on upgrading, and this kind of ties into what we were talking about with libraries augmenting the abilities of agents. We're working on sort of an upgrade or a reimagining of Ogre, where we would be able to pull the state out of any agent and store it arbitrarily somewhere to be restored at a later date. The current operation of Ogre is merely to do that for group resources and chats. So, and you'll forgive me for just 1 second. I'm going to close my window because I have a leaf blower. 1 second. Sorry about that. So yeah, Ogre is designed to do that for resources and graphs. I actually did release this recently, but effectively what it allows you to do is point to a resource that you have access to, that you've already downloaded, a graph, I should say, that you have access to on your ship, and export that as a JAM file to be re-imported somewhere else. The import of this for us was that there's quality information available in some dead groups, right? As people come onto Urbit and leave for a time, maybe to come back later or whatever, sometimes information gets abandoned, and we certainly didn't want to lose that information, nor did we want to keep it in merely the static format of a graph sitting in GraphStore that we could like scry out individual chats from. So we built Ogre to extract that information and allow us to place it somewhere else. It's the way that we rebuilt small computers after that was a little bit, I don't want to say abandoned, because there are still proprietors there who are working hard to keep that group alive. But some of the resources there were abandoned. And we were able to bring those back up to speed.
Does it work across breach eras, I suppose, because it's just jamming the content?
Yeah. And we're actually, for the upgrade, that's a great question. For the upgraded version, we're trying to figure out how we can best authenticate both the sending of backup, that is to say, the poke that would store some data as a backup, and the validation of data coming from the backup server to a ship. And so we're thinking about ways where we can check public keys against the record that's available in Azimuth to see, like, hey, is this really a record or a backup that came from my ship in a prior era or not, right? Like, does this have the indicia of authentic, of verifiability to it, like the indicia of truth to it? But yes, it works cross breach right now, and sort of it's very laissez-faire at this point. It'll let you do even things that might be a bad idea, like loading a chat as a publish or what have you, right? Which makes the front end go all sorts of crazy.
We speak at least 2 dialects of Markdown.
Yeah, right.
All right, let's see. You've built Wordoo and you've built Gora. Do you want to say anything about those products?
Yeah. And so this sort of leads me into this kind of more experimental thought I have about Urbit that I think is reasonable. And so I'll wend my way to talking about Urbit or Wordoo and Gora, if you'll bear with me for just a second here. As I said, my professional career never included specific training in computer science. I sort of picked it up as I went, and to the extent that I needed to. Always, though, looking at what could have been, looking at the idea of me in a career of computer programming or a more specifically tailored IT career, I thought, gee, there's just so much that I don't know. And to start from the ground and work my way all the way up is what I should have been doing starting in high school. But now we're at a time scale where I can't do that anymore, right? Like, I can't take off of life for 6 years to try and understand how computers work. And so it was always very daunting and very discouraging, even though that was, I think, the ambition that I had to work in that field. And as I say, when I came to Urbit, my lack of context surrounding computer programming made learning Hoon very difficult at first, and very challenging, and required of me the creation of new neural pathways that didn't exist before, ways of thinking about what I'm doing on a computer that didn't exist before. But what I found over using Urbit for the time that I have is that it being a reductive, that Urbit was designed as a response to the classical stack that I was also having trouble with, right? Urbit is this response to, let's start with Unix and then we'll layer this on top of it, and we'll have Python and we'll have SQL and we'll have JavaScript to servers, and we'll have JavaScript front ends, and we'll have intercommunicate, right? And so all of these things keep getting built on top of each other. Urbit was this response to this, saying that is unsustainable. And similarly, my response to the stack was that is too much for me to interact with personally, for me to be able to master in any meaningful way. And to the extent that Urbit was a response to the same things that I found daunting in the computational stack, it was also something like a computing toy, a way of dipping my toes into the activity of computing without the dangers associated of that weight, of that monumental weight of the classical stack descending on me. And so it's very, very metaphorical, right? Like, obviously, the worst I could have done was break my Linux server if I tried to learn computers the classical way. But Urbit was just this distillation of the things that I thought of as important in computing. I think maybe I talk about this a little too, but this distillation of the important parts of computing for me: identity, networking, being able to access data, being able to write programs. Like, just the idea of writing a program was something I thought of as integral to computing, but not something that I could actually start on before Orbit, or at least not something that I meaningfully started on outside of Visual Basic for applications, which we can debate as to whether or not that's writing a program. But there's something important about toys generally for me. Even like to bring it back, the Casio toy PDA that I had, it was a low risk entry point into using a device that I was not familiar with, into giving me the ability to interact with something that I had not interacted with before. And what I've found in playing on Urbit is that I learn more about the thing to which it is responsive than I thought I was capable of doing before entering into Urbit. So, like, I think the best example of this is I really wanted to understand how to write sale web pages. And as a result of doing that on Urbit in the restricted, well, the decomplicated way that Urbit allows you to render web pages, I actually learned a lot more about how, like, HTTP actually works and what's actually going on when your browser loads a page. And, like, it's just fascinating to me. At a certain point, I was like, holy shit, I understand how the internet works. Like, when did that happen, right? But this playfulness, this ability to play in the toy of Urbit, to have those concepts distilled for me, and then to be able to build them back up to the larger concept that they existed as prior to the invention of Urbit, was, I don't know, it was really astounding. It kind of surprised me that happened. So it was really important. So to get to the other point, Quartus, to the extent that we can, we try and build tools that are tractable, that are legible, that encourage the users to interact with them in novel ways and do interesting things with them, like we have with Crow, like we have with Orca. Gora does that similarly. We had a user who said, I miss chain mail. Like, nobody sends out chain letters anymore. So we implemented a function in Gora that would allow you to send chain letters that could be forwarded on, but not controlled by the original party, and could kind of spread through the network and hopefully clog up everyone's pipes as fast as possible. I don't know if anyone's used that technology, but we like the playfulness of our software. And we hope that the things that we build allow people to engage a little more meaningfully with other things that they might be referential to, that they might be confusing. So.
All right, we should probably jump to questions now, since we've only got about 7 minutes left here at the end.
Let's do it.
There's a couple of older questions that jump back a little bit. So here's one very interesting concept. So this idea is using the deterministic nature of Urbit to build a logical model of the world through the collection of reproducible facts.
Yeah, and I would say maybe, so first, we're not completely solidified on the idea, and so I am sort of theory crafting here. Secondly, maybe, like we talked about the knock versioning, but I expect that human knowledge will never be a pure Kelvin zero, but that eras of human knowledge could be, as we kind of discussed with like the models of the atom and solidifying those over time. Yes, I think the deterministic and the long tail of history that Urbit presents for us should allow us to have new logical models for how the world works, new abilities to present reproducible facts, or even historical facts that have been augmented by later data in a more convincing narrative format.
That's an interesting idea of doing it per era of human knowledge, because the fate of scientific theories is either that they become completely articulated, like what's happened with classical thermodynamics or optics, and there's essentially nothing new to say about them, right? They're pure engineering at this point. Or like Newtonian, or Aristotelian and then Newtonian mechanics, as they become more articulated, they start to accrue a subset of small problems that ultimately points the way to the incommensurable break to the next insight.
Right.
The next
When you start
dominating
making,
theory.
when you start doing epicycles, you know something's wrong, right? Like that, but that's good. And this is the part that really drives me nuts about Neil deGrasse Tyson, is that he's dismissive of those prior models. And it's like, dude, we would not be here without the Bohr model. Like you have to accept that those things were brilliant and that they were true enough at the time, right? They were representational truth.
You heard it here, folks. Urbit is on the side of Niels Bohr.
That's right.
All right, here's another one. Have you all considered extending or supplementing Clay's content addressing schema to assign stable addresses to content which is not hosted within the ship?
This sounds like remote scry to me. Yeah, I think the omnipresent namespace is definitely something that is in Tlon's hands, and I have high confidence that they will achieve their goal there. I think that might be beyond my team's capacity presently, but I suspect that we will have universal addressing soon.
All right, I think that's what we have today. Let's see, where is the Hangout link? I'll work on getting that in just a moment. So thank you so much, Rabsef. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. I didn't realize that you'd done so much in the philosophy of science and epistemology, so that was a fun sideline there.
Yeah, this was great. I really appreciate you having me. Thank you. And did our group?
There's our link.
Yeah, perfect.
There's our link.
All right.
All right, I'll leave that up. I guess the chat will live here, so we'll go ahead and end for today, and we'll see you all in a few minutes over there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, and next month, Hodzod Walrus will talk about Ukbar, so you won't want to miss that one either.